Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
Thank you. So just a really short introduction to myself. I mean, most of it was already said, but kind of why am I talking here? So at Wooga, I'm responsible for making the games grow as much as possible. So our CEO focuses on product development, on making games. He gets to do all the cool, fun stuff. And then I try and make the games grow. And actually, marketing plays an ever-increasing role in that. So when we started a few years ago, it was all about Facebook virality, optimizing the feed, these kinds of things. But now we do go out and spend money on marketing. And for the last years, the holy grail has always been LTV CPI. So lifetime value, the value of a player needs to be larger than what you spend to get him. Sounds pretty basic kind of business thing, right? If you're going to spend $2 on getting a player and you're only earning $1 with his revenue, you're going to be losing money. And this was a view many people in the industry took and focused a lot on kind of attributing users, fingerprinting them, going in, figuring out how much they're worth, optimizing the CPI. But we feel that's not enough anymore. But I'll quickly run you through this equation one more time, just so we have a common understanding. So starting with LTV, that's definitely the more tricky bit. So what we do is we define LTV as the 7-day bookings a user pays. So we take the sum of the revenue of the first 7 days, and then we multiply that out. And I'll explain what this multiplier is in a few seconds. But so what you have in here is the kind of 7-day retention and spending potential, and then a multiplier which reflects the lifetime value of the user. And we add ad revenue. And so I put some numbers up. These are obviously completely made up. But so let's say we have a user who spends 20 cents in his first 7 days. We know due to the retention curves we have how long he's going to stick around. So we multiply that out, add 60 cents for ads, and that's kind of the lifetime value of a player. Now you may ask, why 7 days and why a multiplier? And I promise you not the whole presentation is going to be graphs and curves and numbers, but in the beginning we need to do a bit of this. So this is, let's say, a curve of how much a group of users spends in your game. In the beginning, there's a ton of users who start churning out, but then that's when the curve is still relatively steep. And then after a bit, the kind of loyal players stay and keep on spending money, and that's when the curve goes flat. And actually, I think the trick of building large games is in having curves which are almost flat, but never quite, in a way, so people stick around. I think Pearl's Peril, our large hidden object game, is a good example, where we have a 720-day retention. So after 2 years, 8% of players still play on a daily basis. And that's, in those cases, you have these curves which just kind of go out forever. Now, if we go out and spend marketing money on our campaigns, we can't wait a year to see if the money we spent yesterday was actually worth it or not. I mean, that would be a pretty fast way to go out of business. And so what we've built is a system where we look at the first, I mean, obviously also look at the first and the third day of data. That will be more around retention and engagement. But then once you have 7 days of booking, you can use those to estimate how much the players will pay in their lifetime. And that actually works pretty well. So that's kind of the big secret around predicting LTV, is look at 7-day bookings, figure out how the lifetime curve is of your game, and multiply that out. Now, CPI, the other side of our equation, is a lot easier. Go to the ad network you mistrust the least, give them $1,000, they'll run 1 million banners, send you some clicks, installs, and you have a CPI. So that's fairly straightforward. And that's what people were doing let's say, saying, okay, CPI is 150, LTV is $2, okay, let's spend some money. Now, the problem we had is how do we spend in this very competitive market? Because you have a game like Jelly Splash, which people really like. I think the rating is 4.6, 4.7%, good retention, but it's a casual match 3 game. And how do we compete with a game of war, Machine Zone, or Clash of Clans, or any of the mid-core titles, the social casino companies? When you have casual games, how do you compete with them on an LTV CPI basis? I'd argue it's almost impossible if you take this extremely tight view of what you're doing. So we started analyzing our numbers quite a bit more and actually took a step back and thought about, and this is where I'm going over to the holistic marketing view, where do our new users come from? And in the end, we distilled it down to there's not that many sources in the end. So on the top left corner, we have ads, which is what I was talking about, banners, UA, rewarded video, all that stuff. We have the App Store optimization, keywords, icon, Jelly Splash, someone's looking for jelly beans, sees Jelly Splash, likes the icon, installs it, this kind of stuff. You have TV ads if you're doing them. We were doing them at the time. You have general social media and word of mouth. And what we thought about is, well, what share of users comes through which channel? And what we actually did is we put a pop-up in the game and asked people, how did you hear about this game? And obviously there's a ton of biases because people are notoriously hard in remembering where they actually heard about something first. But the numbers were interesting. So for Jelly Splash, and I mean, we were obviously able to validate the upper left bit with the ads. Only about 20% of the users came through ads. And then another 20% came through the App Store, so discovery and search and featuring. 20% was TV. But then we had 30% word of mouth and 10% social media. And we were wondering if we're only looking at CPI LTV on an individual user basis, we're looking at this one user who comes from ads, but we're not looking at the 4 other users who somehow go into the app. And how do we incorporate that? By the way, these numbers are quite different for different games. So in Pearl's Peril, for example, about 60% of the users come through ads. So the viral factor is a lot lower. Well, these numbers led us to kind of question what we were doing, especially in the field of very casual apps. And what we thought is, sorry for the awesome stock photo I found on the internet, but we thought we'd need to go into some kind of more holistic view of our marketing budget and not look at every individual users. And we ran a lot of numbers in the end, kind of with an analytics team to try and break these organic users, as we call them, so everyone who's not attributable to an app install. We broke them out into 3 groups, and this is something which kind of looks intuitive in a way, but it's actually based on data. So you have what we call the organic baseline, which is maybe for a larger company brand awareness, like other games by Wooga, these kinds of things, and App Store optimization. So it's something you can optimize as well through clever App Store optimization, but that's just a baseline of organic users, which seems relatively constant over time as well, no matter what you do. The upper 2 get a little bit more interesting. The middle one, we found a very strong correlation between the DAU, so the daily active users, and the new users your app already has, and the number of organics coming in. So that kind of makes sense, right? Because if more people play your game, they're probably going to spread it further than if you have a very small game. What is interesting is the new user part as well. So in countries where we had a lower number of new users coming in, organics also started to come down. And in those situations, you could have a case to do, let's say, a push marketing campaign, influencer, community work to get the new users up into your game, which will then again lead to more organics. And finally, you have the spillover effects of advertising spend. So a really big case for us was our Agent Alice launch earlier this year, where we coordinated a pre-launch buzz campaign. We did PR, we did community, we did YouTube sponsoring, we got Apple featuring, we did a burst, everything in 1 week. And what we saw is all these different channels started spilling over into each other. And over time, the install rates, but over time meaning days, install rates on banners went up, click rates, etc. And organics hugely increased as well. So, but these are kind of three ways to think about it, about your organics, to look at your baseline, what you're doing on just App Store optimization, your brand, look at your game, how can you trigger word of mouth, how can you trigger virality from the people already playing it, and then the last one is look at your marketing spend. And what I'm going to do now is to share 4 or 5 random learnings around organics. I'm sorry it's not more structured, but I kind of plucked out stuff I thought was interesting. The next one, I've purposely put this up here to make it look complicated. I think the takeaway is really, without going into these graphs, is there's very significant virality differences between countries. So what we saw, for example, I don't know if it's stereotypical, but for example, France, highly viral country, UK, US, somewhere in the middle, Germany, Austria, much lower, Nordics completely at the bottom, only one lower is Poland and Russia. So there's very significant differences in virality between countries, and that it actually should lead you to think about also where do you run influencer campaigns, where do you do community marketing, in which way, because there are simply people who like talking about games and people who don't, and there seems to be more in some countries than in other. The next part is we looked at the people answering these polls and tracked that back into our player information database. So we looked at how much do they play, how long do they retain, how much do they spend. And actually people who self-report as coming from word of mouth over-index on retention and engagement. Not on monetization, but on retention and engagement, they over-index pretty significantly compared to paid users. And we are optimized in our paid user acquisition. So I thought that was also pretty interesting. So it kind of makes sense. If a friend tells you about a game, or you hear about it on the internet in a non-commercial setting, it's a self-selection which works. Third bit is you need to include all these non-trackable users in your reporting and budgeting as well. So as probably most people spending money, we have these big Excel sheets where we try and analyze kind of the budget per country, per channel, all that kind of stuff. And if you start working with KPIs like CPI, that doesn't really work. That really doesn't do it justice, because all your organics are out. You need to come up with new KPIs to fully capture all of this. And one of them which we're using is eCPI. So CPI is kind of all marketing spend divided by all paid users, what we had before. eCPI is, let's say last month we spent 500K on a game and we got 1 million new users, so our eCPI is 50 cents. And this is, for example, a really simple metric, but also a powerful one, because in a game like Jelly Splash, you can run into situations where your CPI is actually higher than your LTV, but your eCPI is much, much lower due to organics and virality. And if you feel that there is an kind of a connection between the paid users coming in and the organics you're getting, it can actually make sense to overspend on CPI because you can attribute in the viral effect. And so what we did is we broke out many of our KPIs. So let's say CPI and eCPI are two I described, recoup paid and recoup total is another example. So let's say I'm recouping 50% of a user spend just on the paid traffic, but I'm recouping 300% on a total game basis. So to break out these KPIs, on the one hand taking a view of the individual users, but then also a view of the whole game. All this reporting reworking you'll be potentially doing, by the way, is necessary if you want to try out the new fashionable marketing channels for mobile games. So we were running billboards in South Korea as an experiment. This is the Gangnam Station. You might know the song. We were testing Jelly Splash TV ads For Agent Alice, we also did out of home. And these are examples. I mean, TV, you can still try and attribute something. You know when the spot ran, the user is 15 minutes after that, there's a spike, this is your baseline, let's try and count those in. You can do that kind of work, but once you start running billboards and things, it gets impossible to attribute to cohorts and absolutely impossible to attribute to individual users. And so once you hit limits on your normal UA spend and want to try out TV and out of home and all these interesting things, you will need to have this holistic reporting view. Another learning, long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term ones. So TV was, again, an example for us where we did all this attribution, all this measurement based on the spot times. That actually only captured 1/3 of the uplift. So what we were doing is we were running TV campaigns in one country and then tried to measure it extremely tightly, and that didn't work. When we started comparing countries, this is a package actually Google provides in R, the statistic language. When we started not looking at the effect of individual spots, but simply how does this country develop compared to other countries around it, the effect was 3 times as high. And what we saw is even as we stopped the TV, we still got significantly more organic results coming in for weeks and weeks. So these short-term effects are easier to measure. The long-term effects are potentially much larger. But in the end, don't hide behind complex math. I mean, it's super easy when you're that type of person to come up with regression formulas and you start going very deeply into the math to try and measure all this. This is my kind of last point as well. You need to remember, you need to be able to communicate with product leads, with management, with investors and so on. And if you're saying, I ran these regressions on this and that and we should be overspending by X and all those things, it makes it very hard for people to trust what you're doing. And so that's actually why I really like our LTV formula, because even by now, product leads, product managers, etc. I have 7-day bookings, I multiply that by whatever the factor is for my game, let's say 10, I have 7-day bookings of 10 cents, multiplier of 10, that's $1. It's pretty simple math. Well, if you bring these very complicated formulas out of your analytics team into the company, you could fail. So that's kind of the last point. Don't hide behind complex math. And in the end, start thinking about your LTV, not in terms of CPI, but extending your CPI kind of beyond the directly attributable cost. Good. So that was already it from my side. I believe we have...
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. Please give him a hand.
Thank you.
I'm pretty sure there are questions from the audience. We have a few minutes to answer some questions. Yes.
Hold on just a second. Oh, you got it. Great.
Great. Thanks for the great talk. The question I wanted to ask you is the multiplier. Maybe I missed it, but I wasn't sure how you come up with that number 10 or 12 and stuff.
Yes. So it's you use curve fitting algorithms. So what's interesting is that the curves always have more or less the same shape. They're just kind of moved up and down in a way. And so what you do is you look at your cohorts of data. When you have a new game, it's hard. Obviously, it's easy when you have a game which is a year old. If you have a game which is half a year old, you can already see the shape of the curve. If it's 90 days, it's a little bit more shaky and so on. So what we do is we actually once per month look at the shape of these retention, well, actually it's monetization curves, and then adopt and change the multipliers accordingly. And the older your game is, the more it's fact, and the earlier it is, the more it's fiction.
All right, got it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Questions? Yes.
So you mentioned that casual versus mid-core seems to be impossible to survive in this industry now. Are you guys planning to move into the mid-core?
So our structure is we have 6 studios internally and a total of 14 games in development, of which I would say 5 to 6 will soft launch and will launch maybe 2 to 3. So we have a relatively wide pipeline and then a process to kind of winnow down. We're not making Clash of Clans in space or something like that. I don't believe that's successful. A number of our game teams are working on existing genres, so we are making a number of puzzle match 3 games, a number of hidden object games, and we are also testing new genres. So I think it's not impossible to be successful in these genres. I mean, there's, I don't know, Gummy Drop, Cookie Jam, there's not only Candy Crush out there. It's not impossible. I do think you have to be smart in your marketing, and it's branching out from UA into all these new fields. And today I didn't talk about doing it, I just talked about measuring it in a way. But I mean, obviously there's a lot of opportunity to be creative. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think one more question. Yeah. Oh, 2. Okay.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. When it came to, you were talking about the long tail of when you were doing out-of-home advertising, like the billboards and other things. What made you feel a comfort level of attributing that to, say, the bus thing or the TV thing versus maybe just word of mouth is up because of this thing over here, and yet you're looking at the long tail attributing it to, is it everything or more that bus advertising worked or whatever?
So I think for most non-kind of directly trackable forms of media, there are approximations. So for example, TV, you can do this after the spot bump. Then for out-of-home, you can start looking at postcodes, these kinds of things, zip codes in the US to try and approximate that. But in the end, there is a certain amount of, in the end, attribution all over. And that's why I think it's important to, this one graph I showed, that was actually with the blue line. That was how Germany had developed, where we were doing a lot of these campaigns versus UK, France, and Scandinavia. So what we actually did is use UK, France, and Scandinavia as control groups, run this large holistic campaign in Germany and look at the uplift. Now within that, then I have trouble attributing the uplift to out-of-home versus TV, or that's kind of iffy in a way. I can try, but I know that the whole approach is better than the other one. And so what we're moving into now is to always keep certain countries as a control, try something new in a different country, look how it works, keep that steady, transfer it to the other country, and so on. So there's a whole kind of campaign plan. In the end, it's almost getting into very traditional consumer goods marketing, where you run TV ads, sell more soap a month later, and try and figure that out. But it's getting less exact in a way.
Just one follow-up. Did you ever put in promo codes to track that?
Yeah, it's that could be another one of these kind of micro indicators, but I don't think they would capture the whole effect. TV is a very good example where I believe you're also building brand recognition, which will improve your click rates on your banners and your install rates, but that effect is very hard to measure.
Okay.
You'd mentioned like a more expanded eCPI model where you're attributing not only the directly attributable installs, but everybody else. Isn't the worry that the mid-core folks that are spending a lot more per user are targeting more directly for a certain kind of demographic, they're also as sophisticated, and then the whole movement of the CPIs that you're moving, if Clash of Clans and Game of War can spend with this kind of analysis now, you're not one step ahead. You're at the same place.
It's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, I think performance marketing is also often about exploiting a series of tactical advantages, where if you're always a little bit better than the other people, you can outperform. The second answer is I think certain genres are more viral than others. So I think social casino is a good example, where people generally don't tell their friends, hey, I just spent $10,000 on a virtual slot app. While in Jelly Splash, it's like, this app helps me zone out, and it was really fun, and I beat level 120, is something you would say. So those would be my 2 points. On the one hand, yes, I mean, obviously the Machine Zone, Kate Upton thing, or Supercell with their Super Bowl ads, you see they're moving very strongly in that direction, or already there. But I do believe that this marketing view will help the casual games more than it does the core games.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan.
You're welcome.